This BBC podcast is supported by ads outside the UK.
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello. Today we tell the story of one man's escape from a criminal scam centre in Myanmar. In Canada, we look on as King Charles walks a diplomatic tightrope. In Mexico, the government has pledged judicial reform, but the shadow of the cartels still lingers. And finally, while the Dutch are renowned for their sensible pragmatism, our correspondent was surprised by the emotional response she received when her bike was stolen. But first, as Donald Trump's relationship with Vladimir Putin appears to be cooling, warmer ties continue to be forged between Russia and America through a religion. An increasing number of Americans, especially young men, are converting to Orthodox Christianity, enticed by its embrace of unabashed masculinity and traditional family values. The Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia, known as ROKOR, was first established in the 1920s. Today it's headquartered in New York and has churches all over the US. Lucy Ash met some recent converts in Texas.
It's a drizzly afternoon, but the children around me are racing about, oblivious to the rain. Somebody's doll, accidentally dropped into a pond, is fished out to loud whoops and cheers. Mothers bustle around the farmhouse kitchen, laying out snacks and tidying scattered rubber boots. Most are parishioners of Father John Whiteford, whose church is in the town of Spring, just north of Houston. Father John scoops up his passing granddaughter for a hug before explaining why the women here have opted to homeschool their children. You can use the textbooks you want, you can teach kids about your faith, and they don't get taught about 57 genders of the month or whatever, he says. Ashley, one of the mums, demurely dressed in a flowing skirt and kerchief around her head, tells me she doesn't hate transgender people, she prays for them. Nodding approvingly, Father John adds that the way to help people with what he calls a self-destructive lifestyle is to teach them how to live according to God's natural order. If the Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia, or ROKOR, was originally designed for so-called cradle Orthodox, to serve people around the world with Slav roots born into the faith, it has a different mission today. In a shed behind his blue-domed church, Father John shows me a big steel horse trough. He now uses it to baptize a constant flow of adults, switching from Protestant and Catholic churches. ROKOR's most senior cleric in Texas, Archpriest John Whiteford, is himself a convert from the Evangelical Church of the Nazarene. He stresses that his new parishioners include a couple of teenage girls and a female oil tanker captain, but most are young men. Over at another ROKOR church in Georgetown near Austin, the trend is unmistakable. On Sunday, I spot more than a dozen men in their 20s and 30s praying and crossing themselves at the back of the nave. One of them, Theodore, a software engineer, says he felt as if there was a hole in his heart until he found orthodoxy. Society has been very harsh on men, he explains, and is constantly telling them they're in the wrong. Men are criticised for wanting to be the breadwinners, supporting a stay-at-home wife. We're told that's a very toxic relationship these days, he complains. Theodore now lifts weights 3 times a week with the priest of his church, Father Moses McPherson, and says he feels spiritually and physically sustained by his new faith. the barrel-chested priest, tells his congregation no saint ever promoted birth control. He posts his wife's positive pregnancy test online, baby number 6, and tells his followers that masturbation is pathetic and unmanly. In his online videos, Father Moses hams up his unabashed virility. Skinny jeans, crossing your legs, using an iron, shaping your eyebrows, and even eating soup are all mocked as too girly. Orthodoxy is not masculine, it's just normal, he tells me. But in the West, everything has become very feminized, he says, and services in some Protestant churches are just like a Taylor Swift concert, all emotion, he adds. During the liturgy, Rokor priests routinely honour Patriarch Kirill, head of the Mother Church in Moscow. I asked Father Moses if he agrees with Kirill that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a holy war. Have you got another question? He snaps. Father John assures me that the Patriarch's words have been distorted, though the Russian Patriarch's warmongering is now incontestable. And an army of Orthodox influencers who film themselves against a backdrop of icons don't shy away from geopolitics either. One content creator, a firefighter in the city of Lockhart, just south of Austin, tells me he can't understand why the mainstream media attack Russia so much. Another one, who co-hosts a podcast called World War Now, was invited to Moscow recently to meet Alexander Dugin, the neo-fascist philosopher some call Putin's Rasputin. Though not all Orthodox converts in the US are alike. Scott Kenworthy, a professor of comparative religion in Ohio, says his parish, which belongs to a Russian-rooted but different branch of the faith, the Orthodox Church of America, is absolutely bursting at the seams, and many arrived after the COVID pandemic. Some sought a more traditional and more demanding religion. Orthodox liturgies are at least twice as long as Protestant services, and there are no pews. The congregation stands throughout. But Scott says his church has learned to screen out anyone drawn to the hyper-masculinity or pro-Putin politics pushed by some clerics. These days, his priest asks each prospective convert to write an essay titled, "Why do I want to become an Orthodox Christian?" He's been impressed by the answers so far, but watches out for any red flags, or should I say, red pill rhetoric along the way.
Lucy Ash, and you can hear more on this story on Crossing Continents on BBC Sounds. Next, the diplomatic fallout between the US and Canada continues as Donald Trump again repeated his desire to make America's northern neighbour the 51st state. The issue was in the forefront of Canadian minds as King Charles went to Ottawa this week, with locals looking for signs of support for the country's sovereignty. Our royal correspondent Sean Coughlin sat in on the King of Canada's historic speech to Parliament and spotted a familiar face in the crowd, sporting some groovy green trainers.
When King Charles stepped off the plane into the Ottawa sunshine this week, he was stepping straight onto a diplomatic tightrope. I was there at the airport to watch him come down the steps with Queen Camilla, the royal visitors greeted by a carefully choreographed collection of Canadian representatives. In front of a forest of maple leaf flags, the King and Queen were greeted by Prime Minister Mark Carney, a group of French and English-speaking schoolchildren, and members of Canada's First Nations communities, banging a traditional drum. And banging a drum for Canada was what this trip was all about. Perhaps loudly enough to warn off their neighbour, a certain Donald Trump, whose ambition to take over Canada hung over this entire trip without his name ever being officially mentioned. And that takes us back to the diplomatic tightrope, because King Charles is head of state of both the United Kingdom and Canada. That means when he speaks in the United Kingdom, it's on the advice of UK ministers, and when he speaks in Canada, it's on the advice of the Canadian government. That might be complicated, but usually it's not that problematic, because Canada and the UK tend to be pushing in the same direction. That was before the turmoil created by President Trump. It's meant that in the UK, King Charles has been used to spearhead a charm offensive to maintain good relations with Trump, offering him an invitation for an unprecedented second state visit. That went down badly with some Canadians. I write the BBC's weekly royal newsletter, and we had angry emails from Canadians saying how much the invitation annoyed them when they were facing calls for their country to become the US 51st state. There are already a significant number of anti-monarchists in Canada, and French-speaking Quebec's National Assembly has voted to end all ties with the monarchy. It raised the question, how could the same person draw Trump closer to the UK while at the same time push him away from Canada? So the King's trip to Canada and his speech to Parliament, written by the Canadian government, had become a big deal. The first test of the public mood came soon after the King had left the airport and gone for a meeting with Prime Minister Carney at the Governor-General's residence. A tree was going to be ceremonially planted, and let's be honest, tree planting is not much of a spectator sport. But crowds had turned out and seemed very keen to see the King. After some shovelling, the King waved the spade as though he had scored a last-minute equaliser in a cup final. He was getting some big cheers and went on a walkabout into the crowd. And cheering is not that typical. Journalists like to write about cheering crowds, but in reality, most crowds now just hold up their phones and take pictures. But the King is good with crowds. He often seems to enjoy diving towards the people lining the barriers more than the formal handshakes and photos. It's something that few politicians would risk now. The main event of the King's trip was to open Canada's Parliament, the first time a monarch had done so for almost 70 years. The usual Senate building is being renovated, so instead the parliamentarians have been using a building that was once Ottawa's main railway station. So, on what had been the station concourse, Canada's Parliament awaited this royal arrival. There was a nervous buzz about the place, with these usually sombre lawmakers taking selfies and chatting, like guests before a wedding. There was a big presence of Canada's First Nations representatives, wearing traditional clothes and spectacular feather headdresses. Former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was also there, showing that this really is a relaxed country, by wearing a pair of green trainers to this formal event. Then King Charles arrived. The King of Canada was there to read out the government's speech in French and English. This was a slice of history. There were lines about the country staying strong and free and protecting the sovereignty of Canadians and guarding their democratic rights. It wasn't so much a subtext as a big bold text as bright as a Mountie's jacket. If the King had worn a Hands Off Canada t-shirt, it couldn't have been much clearer. The chamber responded with a standing ovation, and outside there were crowds of people lining the streets. Whatever their thoughts about the monarchy, and whatever their thoughts about Canadian politics, they seemed genuinely relieved and pleased to see King Charles there in person. He did another walkabout, shaking hundreds of hands, and someone shouted out, "Thank you for coming, King Charles." The King, with a few poignant looks around the crowd, got into his motorcade of oversized black cars and was swept back towards Ottawa's airport. The tightrope had been successfully crossed.
Sean Coughlin. On Sunday, Mexico will become the first country in the world to elect its entire judiciary by direct vote. In total, more than 7,500 legal positions are up for grabs, from local magistrates to Supreme Court justices, following a controversial reform last year. Will Grant travelled to Ciudad Juarez on the border with the United States to meet one candidate who has had doubts raised over her suitability as a judge after she once defended a particularly notorious client.
In the dusty, dangerous Mexican border city of Ciudad Juarez, there is a huge red sculpture in the form of a giant X, which is so large it's visible from El Paso in Texas on the other side of the Rio Grande. The artwork is intended as a celebration of Mexican identity, the intersecting red lines representing the convergence of the two central pillars of Mexicanness, the Aztec culture and the Spanish. Called the Monument to the Mexican People, but known locally as just the X, I was at the foot of the towering structure to meet Silvia Delgado, a candidate for local judge in Sunday's judicial election. As meeting points go, there was certainly no missing it. X literally marks the spot. But as a candidate in mid-campaign, I suspect Silvia also chose it to project an image, that of woman of the people, synonymous with Juarez, for the photograph I took of her in front of it. In a unique election, Silvia Delgado is no ordinary candidate. She was the defense lawyer for probably the most notorious drug lord in the world, Joaquin Guzman Loera, who, much like Juarez's imposing red landmark, is better known by a nickname, El Chapo. After I take the photograph, Sylvia, sharply dressed in a designer black top and pantsuit, her blonde and grey hair pulled back into a tight ponytail, invites me to join her as she canvasses voters. We walk to her parked car outside the law school, where she tells me she's studying for her second master's degree, and climb into her middle-of-the-range SUV, Sylvia apologising for the empty bottles and sweep wrappers strewn across the passenger seat. It's a far cry from the bulletproof cars and armed escorts of her former client. A short drive later, we arrive at a line of traffic near one of the main border crossings in Juarez, the Bridge of the Americas. As the drivers inch forwards, Sylvia weaves between their vehicles, handing out leaflets with her name and face on them. "Hola, I'm Sylvia Delgado, and I'm standing for penal judge," she says brightly. "Vote for me on Sunday, number 12 on the ballot papers." Most are happy enough to wind down their windows and accept a flyer from her. Alongside a short biography, it reads, "Being a judge doesn't just take training, it requires character and steadfastness to take impartial decisions, and above all, the courage that the people deserve." Conveniently absent from her pamphlet, of course, is any mention of her most high-profile case. Sylvia Delgado has not been convicted of any crime and isn't facing any charges. But her detractors are clear. Having worked for El Chapo Guzman should disqualify her from being a judge in Mexico, they say. She bristles at the idea. "Why should it?" she retorts, her heckles immediately raised at the mere suggestion of a conflict of interest. "For doing my job? For defending people's individual guarantees? Why should that make me illegitimate?" she asks. Chief among her critics is a Mexican human rights and transparency NGO called Defensores. They've placed her onto a list of 19 so-called high-risk candidates in the election, which includes several with criminal convictions or alleged links to organised crime. The day before I met Sylvia Delgado in Juarez, I had coffee in Mexico City with the NGO's director, Miguel Alfonso Mesa. "It's not even about whether she's a good person or a bad person," he argues. "The cartel could pressure her to show loyalty because she's already been their employee." Sylvia Delgado detests Defensores and refutes their idea that representing the head of the Sinaloa cartel means she was paid in drug money. "I received a payment which was the same as any normal monthly payment, and which was paid to me by lawyers, members of his legal team," she insists. "I don't ask, for example, where your funds to fly here to Ciudad Juarez came from," she says. "Sure," I answer, "but I'm not El Chapo Guzman." While it was under debate, this legal reform, to elect judges by direct vote, sparked widespread protests by law students and a strike by judicial system employees. The controversial vote is backed by President Claudia Sheinbaum and her supporters, who see it as the democratization of a broken, corrupt and nepotistic system. Others fear the prospect of the ruling party potentially being in control of the presidency, the legislative branch and the judiciary. In the end, turnout will be key. Meanwhile, Sylvia Delgado, the woman who defended Mexico's most wanted drug lord, just hopes the people of Ciudad Juarez put enough X's next to her name to let her sit in judgment of other criminals who are brought before her.
Will Grant.
I'm Kras Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
Next to Myanmar, where Chinese criminal gangs have established lucrative scam centres from which they steal money from unsuspecting victims all over the world. Many of the workers caught up with the fraudsters come from overseas, tricked into travelling to neighbouring Thailand with the promise of well-paid work. They find themselves trafficked over the border where they face exploitation and no way home. After a recent crackdown by Chinese and Thai authorities, thousands of people were freed from the centres. Olivia Ackland tells the story of one man's escape.
Greg, a 40-year-old American, met Isabel on Twitter. She first wrote a comment under one of his tweets. The two started exchanging messages, even flirting. Isabel's profile picture showed her posing in front of the Eiffel Tower, pouting with long, wavy hair. After a few days, Isabel mentioned her crypto holdings and suggested that Greg might want to invest too. Markets are good, she said, pinging over an app. That's how Greg lost thousands of dollars. Of course, Isabel was not a real person. The messages were actually coming from Danny Kamara, a 27-year-old man from Sierra Leone. He was holed up in a tower block in Myanmar, being forced to scam people by a Chinese gang. If he failed to lure Greg in, he risked being tasered or beaten. Once Greg was ready to pour money into a fake investment scheme, the Chinese bosses took over. Danny doesn't know exactly how much Greg lost, he says, but he knows it was a lot. As Danny tells me his story in a breezy beachside bar in Sierra Leone's capital, Freetown, his voice cracks. He feels awful about the people he tricked, he says, and he's barely spoken about it since he escaped the scam farm last year. I need to tell my story, he says. I want to warn others. Danny takes me back to 2022 when he was struggling to find work in Sierra Leone. Then a friend of his sent him a job ad on Facebook by an international school in Thailand that was seeking English teachers. After 2 rounds of phone interviews, Danny was thrilled to be offered a job. His family took out loans to pay for the flight ticket, and he set off to Bangkok. The driver who fetched him from the airport was friendly but didn't speak much English. Danny gazed out of the window as he sped past green rice paddies, excited to be in a new country. He'd never left Sierra Leone before. But he didn't realise that he was hurtling towards Myanmar, which has been engulfed in civil war since 2021. Chinese gangs have set up hundreds of scam compounds there, paying off both rebels and the ruling junta to work on their turf. When Danny's car reached the porous border, a Burmese soldier with a Kalashnikov climbed into the back seat. Suddenly terrified but unable to escape, Danny was delivered to a compound. Inside were several concrete apartment blocks. Armed men patrolled. A tall wall was topped with coils of barbed wire, Danny tells me. It looked like a prison. Danny says his passport and phone were confiscated by a Chinese man at the front desk. He was left in a dormitory where 6 Indian men were sprawled on bunk beds. One of them explained to Danny that he'd been trafficked to do scam work. As the team mainly targeted Americans, they started work at midnight, which is just before noon in New York. Danny's roommates were resting before starting another 18-hour shift. Danny describes the main office as a large hall where hundreds of people from China, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, Ethiopia, Uganda, and other countries were hunched over long tables, each operating multiple phones and a laptop. Chinese supervisors hovered around them. Chinese gangs first set up bases in the region so they could run illegal gambling websites for users back home, away from the scrutiny of their government. But when Beijing cracked down on the sites 4 years ago, they moved into a new trade, scamming people. Danny was enrolled in a 2-week training course on how to swindle people. He was told to pose as an attractive woman using photos stolen from Instagram and trawl social media or dating sites for his victims. After earning someone's trust, he was instructed to push them to invest in a fake scheme, usually one related to crypto. Failure to reach targets would result in a beating, Danny says. But after 1 month, Danny refused to run any more scams. He tells me he was beaten and starved for several days. Then he was thrown out. He was luckier than some to get out alive. Back in Sierra Leone, Danny has enrolled in a master's degree and is trying to start again. But at night, he still wakes up in a cold sweat, dreaming he's back in the compound. At the end of our chat, he asks me if I can warn people across the continent about the Chinese gangs. Be careful if someone tells you they have a job for you in Thailand. Do not go, he says. Stay in Africa and wait for a better opportunity.
Olivia Ackland. And finally, the Dutch, renowned for their love of cycling, more than a quarter of their journeys are made by bike, which made it all the more maddening for our correspondent Anna Holligan when she recently had her bike stolen in her hometown of The Hague. But the experience did have an upside, as her story sparked a surprisingly strong response from the public, showing a softer side to the pragmatic Dutch.
I'm always careful to strip emotion from my emails here in the Netherlands. I know when Dutch people read the standard British niceties, "How are you? Hope you're well," they see them as superfluous and inauthentic. The Dutch tend to consider this sort of etiquette as indulgent or insincere. This is a country that celebrates directness, efficiency, rules and order. Just be normal, because that's crazy enough, is the national mantra. Which is why I was surprised by the overwhelming displays of sympathy about the theft of my electric cargo bike. I discovered the transformative nature of cargo bikes while filming a documentary during the pandemic. I watched families in Amsterdam pile their toddlers along with a picnic, paints and various other pieces of paraphernalia into the wheelbarrow-like hold and effortlessly transport them to the park. And I decided to buy my own. My daughter was the inspiration for the hefty investment. She was 4 years old, about to start school, and I'd been deliberating over how I'd manage the daily 12-mile back-and-forth school run alongside trying to hold down a job as a foreign correspondent. The cargo bike bought me time. Each morning, we'd glide through The Hague's elm and linden tree-lined streets, the air tinged with the salty scent of the sea. My daughter sitting up front, her lively chatter mingling with the quiet whir of spinning spokes. I'd drop her at school, then share Dutch news from the Cycle Path, a social media mini-series, as a way to turn my commute into something productive and give people a glimpse into this country's carefully cultivated cycling culture. People often assume cycling is in the Dutch DNA, but it wasn't always this way. In the 1970s, cars dominated and the roads were among Europe's deadliest. A journalist's daughter was killed on her way to school, sparking a campaign called Stop the Child Murder. The oil crisis followed, heralding car-free Sundays, partly to keep costs down. Together, they propelled the Dutch cycling revolution. In a country where cycling is now almost as intuitive as walking, your bike becomes an extension of yourself. And my bike, with its battered stickers, rusted lock and bendy ring light, became an intrinsic part of me. Eventually, we transformed it into a mobile solar-powered broadcasting studio, the Bike Bureau, with my laptop and cafetiere propped up on a concertina-style desk that rose up from inside the cargo section. Using it after dropping my daughter off at school felt like that moment Clark Kent transforms into Superman. Locals would often nod as I passed, giving a wave, sometimes exclaiming, Dutch news from the Cycle Path. Here, cycling is the first step toward belonging. I recently cycled past a hotel converted into temporary accommodation for asylum seekers, where children still learning Dutch careered around on borrowed bikes. Je kunt nog geen Nederlands spreken, maar je kan wel fietsen. I overheard two elderly women chuckle. You can't speak Dutch yet, but you can cycle. When I went to the police to tell them my beloved bike had been stolen, they spoke gently as if I'd lost a pet. Neighbours stopped me in the street, asking if I was okay. My story made headlines too, featured in national newspapers and broadcast on the evening news, not just because of a surge in bike thefts, which has been a growing problem here, but because everyone in the Netherlands understands what it means to lose your wheels. And while everyone here seems to own a bike, bike theft is endemic. Without a national register like cars, bikes drift through shadowy chains of steal on demand and resale. Just days ago, police raided a shop selling stolen electric bikes. I'm still hoping one of them might just be mine. My insurance has paid out. My new bike has been ordered and should arrive within weeks. Meanwhile, the company that made my bike has lent me a temporary replacement. Back in the saddle, I've rejoined the flow, rediscovered my flow, whizzing between work and school, and reminded that riding a bike in the Netherlands, like Dutch communication, is all about efficiency and connection. And through the cycle paths, even as strangers, we're united by those red bike lanes, like arteries crisscrossing the city, sustaining its life.
Anna Holligan. And that's all for today, but you can hear more stories on the From Our Own Correspondent podcast on BBC Sounds, including a dispatch from a small island in the South China Sea where the Philippines is taking a stand against China. We'll be back again next Saturday morning. Do join us.
I'm Annabelle Dees, and from BBC Radio 4, this is Shadow World, The Smuggler.
People coming to this country was making me successful.
A year ago, I met a people smuggler, a British man who joined an international smuggling gang. I uncover his motivations and his methods.
I'm telling you now how easy it is.
And investigate whether his tactics are still possible.
That does leave a really exploitable loophole for individuals who want to do harm.
Shadow World, The Smuggler. Listen now on BBC Sounds.
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
This BBC podcast is supported by ads outside the UK.
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello. Today we're in Washington, where European leaders abandoned holidays and scrambled to the White House amid fears Donald Trump had capitulated to Vladimir Putin. In Seoul, we hear from North Korean construction workers who escaped from Russia after being sent there to work on building sites. In Chile, we visit a German-style village that was once home to a cult. Now it's a tourist destination, but plans to build a memorial are dividing locals. And finally, we're on the banks of the Loire in France, where the penchant for riverside dining in the form of guinguette is making a comeback. But first, from the military flypast to the grandiose entrance on the red carpet to the press conference without any questions, the meeting between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin drew dismay from Western governments. With an international arrest warrant to his name, long isolated from his invasion of Ukraine, the sight of the Russian president being granted a grand welcome was labelled vomit-inducing by former British PM Boris Johnson. Meanwhile, Russia's offensive in Ukraine continues. Steve Rosenberg reflects on how the Alaska meeting was seen in Moscow and what it revealed about the Russian leader's ultimate ambition.
For Russians, Alaska is so near, and yet so far. Barely 50 miles separate mainland Alaska from Russia's Chukotka, and in the Bering Strait, the distance between the two tiny Diomede Islands, one American, one Russian, is only a couple of miles. And yet, From Moscow, with limited flight options, our journey to the US-Russia summit would take the best part of 2 days. We flew to Istanbul, and from there to Frankfurt. Next day, we flew on to Anchorage, where local time is 11 hours behind Moscow. By 3 o'clock in the morning, I was already wide awake and editing a TV report for the BBC's 6 p.m. news bulletin, a scene setter for this surprise summit. Surprise is an understatement. Summits normally take weeks, months to organise. For his meeting with Vladimir Putin, Donald Trump had announced the date and venue on the Friday. The following Tuesday, we were already on our way to Alaska. America's 49th state is blessed with natural treasures, gold and zinc, copper and coal. It is rich, too, in legends, many of them featuring terrifying creatures. Like the giant sea serpent Tijeruk, the slimy, shape-shifting Amikuk that swims through earth to prey on hunters, and the Kushtaka, a half-human, half-otter-like abomination which lures people to their death. Thankfully, we were unlikely to encounter such notorious individuals. The summit was being held in one of Alaska's most secure locations, the Elmendorf Richardson Air Force Base. In the Cold War, it played a key role in defending America from potential threats from Moscow. Now Russia's president would be the guest of honour here. For Vladimir Putin, Donald Trump rolled out the red carpet. Clearly excited by the occasion, he clapped as President Putin walked towards him on the tarmac. They greeted each other warmly and, together, got into the American president's limousine. 3.5 years after his full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Vladimir Putin was being brought in from the cold. It was an historic moment, and a hugely controversial one. Critics of the Kremlin fumed that Mr. Putin had been rewarded for his aggression in Ukraine with a high-profile summit, and despite his repeated refusals to agree to a ceasefire. But Trump supporters gushed that America's president was the only world leader who stood any chance at all of convincing Vladimir Putin to end the war. After passing security, journalists crammed into a hastily erected media centre at the airbase to wait for what we were told was going to be a joint press conference after the talks. In a notebook, I jotted down some questions, just in case I got the chance to quiz the two leaders. When we were eventually invited to take our seats, my hopes rose. I'd bagged a chair right in front of the podium. Minutes later, Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin walked onto the stage. They delivered brief statements and then walked off without taking any questions. Among the journalists in the hall, the sense of bewilderment was palpable. Suddenly, I had far more questions than the ones scribbled in my notebook. Why had there been no press conference? Why had the talks ended sooner than expected? Why had the delegation's working lunch been cancelled? Some things were clear. Not only had President Putin not budged on the question of a ceasefire, but Donald Trump was no longer insisting on one, focusing instead on securing a long-term peace deal while the fighting continued. Back in Russia, pro-government news outlets portrayed this as a diplomatic victory for the Kremlin. They predicted that very soon Donald Trump would present Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky with an ultimatum, forcing him to make territorial concessions to Moscow. And yet, 3 days later, when President Zelensky and European leaders gathered in the White House, Russian media were expressing confusion. Instead of ultimatums, all the talk in Washington was of robust security guarantees for Ukraine. The Russian tabloid Moskovsky Komsomolets wrote this: Zelensky and the Europeans poured sugar into the petrol tank of the Alaskan negotiations. They sweet-talked Trump into seeing their side. The White House has said that plans are underway for a meeting between the presidents of Russia and Ukraine, but Moscow has been playing that down. Which leaves us where, exactly? I'm still wondering, has the Alaska summit brought peace any closer? Is it as close now as Russia is to America across the Bering Strait? Or will the journey to peace in Ukraine continue to take the long way round?
Steve Rosenberg. And you can hear more from Steve and the latest edition of Ukrainecast on BBC Sounds. After the pomp and pageantry of Donald Trump's meeting with Vladimir Putin, 6 European leaders from France, Germany, Britain, Italy, NATO and the EU rushed to Washington, D.C. early this week, interrupting their holidays, to meet with the US President in a show of solidarity with Volodymyr Zelensky. Concerns were mounting that the US President risked capitulating to the demands of the Russian President after he appeared to drop calls for a ceasefire as a precondition for any peace deal. The arrival of the leaders, who waited on the sidelines as the Ukrainian and US presidents met, raised hopes that EU and NATO leaders could help provide a security guarantee for Ukraine. Tom Bateman has been following the twists and turns of an extraordinary week in Washington.
The British Embassy in Washington contains some notable signs of nostalgia and national achievement. A red phone box near a main entrance, a London Underground sign on display as you exit. But this week, it was more the warning signs from our collective history I was interested in as the Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, made his way into the building, past said red telephone box, to answer questions from a hand-picked assortment of British media. He'd just come from the White House, where I'd spent the day reporting. There he joined Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky, 4 other European leaders and the heads of the EU and NATO. An extraordinary delegation on a perilous journey, a day with Donald Trump, just back from his Alaskan adventure with Vladimir Putin. What would the US President do now, after hours in talks with the leader who launched Europe's biggest conflict since World War II? Amid deep anxiety, the Europeans sought Mr. Trump's assurances for a Western security guarantee for Ukraine in the event of any deal with Russia. And they wanted to try to prevent the president pressing Mr. Zelensky into ceding territory before Russia committed to any proposed ceasefire. Their visit was punctuated with a tour of the White House and a photo-op moment where Mr. Trump proudly showed the leaders of Europe's democracies his Trump 2028 and 4 more years hats before a buffet lunch. Later, back at the embassy, Sir Keir's press officers had offered only 1 question per media outlet, and us reporters scrabbled together quickly beforehand to divvy up the subject areas. I was going to ask Sir Keir what he had made of Mr. Trump's meeting with Mr. Putin. I was just back from the Alaska summit, where I'd been struck by the effusive welcome laid on for the Russian leader. And so I put it to the Prime Minister. You've embraced the US leading this process, and yet now you have an American president who has given a red carpet and applause to the architect of this war. What do you say to people who are frightened or concerned that this is turning into appeasement with the UK at the table? I asked him. His answer reflected the almost impossible line European leaders have been trying to walk. They have little choice but to support Mr. Trump's attempts at a deal with Moscow. The alternative could amount to a bust-up with Washington, and with it potentially a collapse of the post-World War II security alliance. But in trying to shore up Ukraine and deter further Russian invasions, they have to try to get something out of the US it seems unwilling to give. How do you, as some Europeans see it, continue to stay on the right side of Mr. Trump and the right side of history? The Prime Minister told me he supported President Trump's efforts to bring about a peaceful settlement of the war. Of course. Sir Keir said, today has shown that we have moved forward. That, in the end for me, has always been the test. Are we making real progress? And today there was a real sense of unity, he said. He added that after the White House meeting, people should feel reassured, because there had been a significant breakthrough on security guarantees, and they were moving towards a meeting involving Presidents Trump, Putin and Zelensky. That was serious diplomacy, he said, and the chance of a lasting, just peace. So could it make progress? Nearly everything now hangs on the extent of American military backing for any deal. The US negotiator Steve Witkoff had raised hopes in Alaska, claiming that the Russians had consented to the Americans supporting a NATO-style Western security guarantee for Ukraine. That was a reference to NATO's all-for-one defence clause, known as Article 5. But since then, Moscow has poured cold water all over that idea. A number of European countries, including the UK, say they are prepared to put boots on the ground in Ukraine to shore up a peace agreement. Mr. Trump has ruled out the Americans doing that. But on Tuesday, he suggested the US could offer air support. Could that mean enforcing no-fly zones or perhaps missile defence? We don't know. But the Russian take on their conversations with Mr. Trump about a security guarantee suddenly made his progress seem a lot less convincing. And the problem is, if the president's peace process falls apart, who does he blame? We left the embassy, walked past the London Underground sign into a sultry Washington night. We filed our interview, and Sir Keir Starmer flew back, as did the other EU leaders, across the Atlantic, in the wake of his words of reassurance. But history's warning signs hang in the air. Will this be Mr. Trump's peace through strength, or American appeasement?
Tom Bateman. The longer the war in Ukraine has raged, the more Vladimir Putin has come to rely on support from North Korea. First, Pyongyang sold ammunition, then sent soldiers. Now it's sending thousands of construction workers to help fill a huge labour shortage created by the war. South Korean intelligence officials have told the BBC that 10,000 workers were sent to Russia last year, and many more are continuing to arrive, with more than 50,000 expected in total. Our Seoul correspondent Jean Mackenzie has spoken to 6 workers who've managed to escape.
When you report on North Korea, like I do, you typically tell stories about a country that's unimaginably poor and isolated, battered by nearly 2 decades of sanctions. When will it finally collapse, is the burning question on the minds of most North Korea watchers. And during the COVID years, the situation seemed more perilous than usual. I got reports that the economy was on its knees, food was scarce, and people were starving to death. The war in Ukraine changed the script. As Vladimir Putin rolled his tanks over his neighbour's eastern borders, he unwittingly handed Kim Jong-un a winning lottery ticket, the chance to get rich beyond his dreams and tighten his grip on power. Because Putin's initial invasion didn't go according to plan, he hemorrhaged weapons and soldiers, and suddenly, an international pariah, he had no friends to call on. Kim Jong-un, forever an opportunist, was ready. Here is a man with an abundance of weapons and a proven disregard for human life. First, he sent shipping containers chock full of ammunition to keep Russian guns firing. And when Ukraine caught Moscow off guard, seizing part of its territory, thousands of poorly trained North Korean soldiers arrived to be unknowingly fed into the Russian meat grinder and save the day. Then, last year, I got a tip-off from one of my intelligence contacts. Kim was preparing to send Putin vast numbers of construction workers to mitigate the country's growing labour shortage. Many of Russia's young men have been killed fighting or have fled the country. This is one of Pyongyang's favourite tried and tested ways to make money. It sent workers abroad for decades, pocketing most of their earnings. But in 2019, countries were banned by the UN from using North Korean labour. The international community, Russia included, was trying to starve Kim of the money to build nuclear weapons. Not anymore. According to my sources, these workers are now everywhere in Russia. But over the past few years, a handful have managed to escape and make it here to South Korea, and I've been able to meet 6 of them and build up a picture of what's happening. They told me they were forced to build high-rise apartments for up to 20 hours a day, every day of the week, and were forbidden from leaving the building sites. This is where they slept, either in overcrowded, bug-infested shipping containers, or merely on the floor of the unfinished apartment blocks. It was like being in prison, just without the bars, said one of the workers, who I'm calling Tay to protect his identity. Tay was the most recent of the escapees I met, and the most nervous. He spoke softly, making little eye contact, scared about what would happen to his family back home if the regime found out he was talking to me. Tay told me he was gripped with fear when he woke each morning, remembering what lay ahead. Often his hands would seize shut, paralysed from the previous day's work. He was filled with shame, he said, when he learnt how little he'd be paid. One night, when everyone was sleeping, he stuffed some clothes under his bedsheets and ran. None of the men I met went to Russia hoping to escape. In North Korea, being posted overseas is considered an honour. Only the most loyal men are chosen, usually after paying hefty bribes, and they go expecting to earn a decent wage. But what these workers experienced in Russia was so crushing they felt compelled to flee. What broke them was not the work alone, but realising how badly their government was prepared to treat them, a government they'd previously idolised. From the outside, they could see the regime for what it really was. The curtain fell. One of the escapees, a smiley, energetic man, still gets upset when he remembers how workers from other countries would bully them and call them slaves. "You're not even men, just machines that can speak," was the insult that hurt him the most. I realised we were all just slaves of Kim Jong-un, not just us workers, but every North Korean, all 25 million of us, he said, visibly angry. Vladimir Putin might be the immediate beneficiary of Kim Jong-un's wartime offerings, but the real dividends are being paid to the North Korean regime. It's estimated Kim has made billions from these deals, once again defying the odds, showing that whatever the world throws at him, he'll find a way to survive. And as always, it's the North Korean people paying the price.
Next.
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
We're in the hills of southern Chile and a Bavarian-style village. Today it's an alluring tourist destination, but it was once home to a religious sect run by a manipulative and abusive leader who collaborated with the dictatorship of General Augusto Pinochet through the 70s and 80s. Now the Chilean government wants to expropriate some of its land to create a memorial for the people who were tortured and killed there during Pinochet's regime. But the people of Villa Baviera are divided, finds Grace Livingston.
The counter is crammed with delectable treats, logs of marzipan drizzled in dark chocolate, slabs of nut-filled cake, and truffles wrapped in cellophane. Coming out of the shop, I see trimmed lawns, sloping red-tiled roofs, and a restaurant with rambling flowers entwined round its porch. Villa Baviera looks like a charming German-style village, though it's actually nestled in the hills of central Chile, but it has a dark past. Once known as Colonia Dignidad, it was home to a religious sect, ruled by an abusive, manipulative leader. German-born Paul Schaefer was a convicted paedophile and Nazi sympathiser who collaborated with the dictatorship of General Augusto Pinochet, who ruled Chile between 1973 and 1990. Schaefer died in prison in 2010, but some of the sect's German residents stayed here and have turned the site into a tourist destination, complete with chalets to rent and even a boating lake. Now the government is going to expropriate some of the land to create a memorial site for the Chilean political prisoners who were tortured and murdered by the Pinochet regime. But the expropriation plan has divided residents of Villa Baviera. Dorothee Munch was born in Colonia Dignidad in 1977. All of the children in the colony were separated from their parents and banned from communicating with them. We lived in single-sex dormitories like barracks, she recalls. From a young age we had to work, cleaning the dishes for the whole community and collecting firewood. The government plans to expropriate 117 hectares of the nearly 5,000-hectare site. This includes buildings used by Pinochet's secret police to torture political prisoners and areas where the victims' bodies were buried. Dorothée disagrees with the expropriation plans because they include the centre of the village, encompassing the current residents' homes and shared businesses, including a restaurant, hotel, bakery and a dairy. We lived under a system of fear. We're rebuilding our lives, and this will make us victims once more. Perhaps people my age could relocate, but for the older residents it would be devastating. But separately, I spoke to several other inhabitants and former inhabitants of Colonia Dignidad who support the plan to create a memorial site. Georg Klauber arrived as a toddler with his parents in 1962 and lived there for nearly 50 years. Like many other residents, he says as a child he was given electric shocks, forced to take psychotropic drugs, and was sexually abused by the sect leader, Paul Schaefer. I think we should have a memorial because so much cruelty happened here to both Germans and Chileans, he says. I cannot believe there's now a restaurant in the place where so many children's tears, urine and blood flowed. The night before visiting Villa Baviera, I sat by a fire with Ana Aguayo in her tiny house in Parral, the nearest town to the former German colony. Anna's brother Luis was a school inspector, a member of the teachers' trade union, and active in the Socialist Party. Luis was quiet. He loved swimming. He dreamed of creating a fairer country, she recalls. On the 12th of September 1973, the day after Pinochet overthrew the elected socialist president, Salvador Allende, Luis was arrested and sent to prison. A few days later, armed police arrived at the jail and dragged him into a van. His family never saw him again. He's one of the 27 people from Parral that the government believes were murdered in Colonia Dignidad. There's evidence that it was the final destination of many other opponents of the military regime, but investigators have found it hard to determine the exact number of victims because Pinochet ordered the bodies of murdered political prisoners to be exhumed and removed. Anna strongly supports the plans for a memorial site. It was a place of horror and appalling crimes. It shouldn't be a place for tourists to shop or dine at a restaurant, she says. It ought to be a place for remembrance, reflection, and for educating future generations so that it never happens again.
Grace Livingston. In the Loire Valley, the summer months bring both extended bank holiday weekends, known as Pont in France, and the return in the last few decades of the guinguette, waterside outdoor bars and dance halls, which were once popular in the 17th and 18th centuries. Jamie Smith-Maillet went to immerse himself in the lively atmosphere and watched the dancers, both young and old, at a Sunday tea dance.
When I first moved to France some 15 years ago, I thought my French wasn't bad, but I learned there were expressions you can only pick up in-country. One such example was a colleague telling me she'd be absent from work that Friday because elle faisait le pont. She was making the bridge. I was bemused by this odd turn of phrase. Being in the heart of the Loire Valley in the city of Tours, it did conjure up a romantic image of sitting down underneath the 18th century arched Pont Wilson, sipping a glass of local valley wine, accompanied with goat cheese on toasted brioche and a drop of honey. An odd excuse for a day off. In France, public holidays don't necessarily fall on a Monday, but on the day they are earmarked to celebrate or commemorate. If that happens to be on a Thursday or a Tuesday, you can expect much of the nation will bridge the gap to or from the weekend by taking off the respective Friday or Monday too. And talking of bridges, ones that cross rivers, the spring marks the return of the much-loved riverside guinguette. A guinguette is a sort of seasonal outdoor bar come eatery come music venue for all ages. They'd fallen a bit out of favour in the last century, but since the 2000s they've come back in style. Guinguette goers sip on craft beer, Vouvray, a fantastic local alternative to champagne, or grenadine cordials, sitting on foldable wooden chairs, benches, or down on the steps by the river. The term guinguette originally referred to an inexpensive wine served in taverns in Paris suburbs, often to avoid taxis in the city. The bars grew popular in the 17th century. In the 18th century, they spread out to the rural areas, where the French holidayed. Many Impressionist painters then captured the relaxed, jovial and mixed-class mood of the taverns, including Renoir in Bal du Moulin de la Galette from 1876. They peaked in popularity during the Année Folle of the 1920s before declining right up until their recent rebirth. I inaugurated my own Ganguette season on a Friday this year. In Tours city centre by the Loire, the bar was packed with all ages and walks of life, as the musical ambience that evening, an electronic DJ set, saw the merry extended weekend breakers slip into a sense of summer. Tours-sur-Loire is one of a handful of summertime venues born out of a growing desire to support local produce, and they're thriving. Upstream, there's a more traditional venue, La Ganguette de Rochecorbon, offering a taste of the past where your call to the venue is live music and the croaking of frogs. It's popular with families and friends who indulge in oversized bowls of fried whitebait, dipped in garlicky aioli. As children run around the elaborate playground, the adults while away the afternoon with a game or two of pétanque. On Thursdays and Sundays, the Triple Marquee is frequented by a regular but ageing crowd of ballroom dancers. The Thé Dansant is the weekly fixture of the Rochecorbon Ganguette with a live band, vocals, trumpets and accordion, accompanying the hundreds of dancers on the stratified ballroom floor under the swirling disco lights and the gaze of smiling onlookers. Talking over the live music and clinking glasses, the co-owner, Romain Morisseau, told me how they had expanded the venue from 30 covers in 1998 to 1,500 today. The Sunday ball caters to an older crowd, he told me, but we've shifted from bal musette to the Rolling Stones to tailor to the changing tastes, he said. Taking a break from dancing on a bench, I met Robert, 80 years old, but he insisted he was one of the younger ones. I've been coming for 20 years, he said. There are lots of attractive women, he laughed, but I'm far too old for that today. As I cycled back downstream to Tours, the recent renaissance of the Ganguette reminded me how the Loire itself has been and still is a source of livelihood, life and living.
Jamie Smith-Maillet. And that's all for today, but you can hear more stories on the From Our Own Correspondent podcast on BBC Sounds. We'll be back again next Saturday morning. Do join us.
I'm Mark Still, and for BBC Radio 4 from Shadow World, this is The People vs. McDonald's.
Hi, boys and girls. How you doing today? It's Ronald McDonald, your friend, and boy, gosh, by golly, we're going to have a lot of fun today.
The longest running trial in English history.
I just felt totally burnt out and I wasn't really able to carry on.
A gardener and a former postman against a global fast food giant.
Corporations should not just be able to suppress people.
With secret surveillance, spies and life-changing deception.
You start thinking, what is reality and what's not reality?
Subscribe to The People vs. McDonald's on BBC Sounds.
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
This BBC podcast is supported by ads outside the UK.
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello. Today we're in Bahrain to attend Shabbat service in the kingdom's only synagogue, where people of all faiths are welcome. In Hiroshima, we speak to survivors of the atomic bomb and the social stigma they faced growing up. And we're in the blue waters of the Adriatic Sea, where sponge divers on the Croatian island of Krapanja are fighting to hold on to their centuries-old tradition. But first to Ukraine, where according to the Ukrainian government, more than 70,000 people have gone missing during the war, leaving families anxious for news of their loved ones. Among those affected are the children of soldiers missing in action, or whose parents have been arrested by Russian authorities. Psychologists say they're among some of the most traumatized children they've worked with. But a Ukrainian charity is trying to give them some relief and much-needed support to help them cope with the ongoing uncertainty of not knowing what's happened to their parents. Will Vernon was given exclusive access to a pioneering summer camp where art, exercise and self-expression are central to the healing process.
At 9 o'clock sharp, silence descends. Across the country, every single day, many Ukrainians interrupt their mourning and take a minute to remember the fallen in this war. For the children attending this summer camp, the ritual is even more poignant. All of them have a parent who's disappeared in the war, soldiers missing in action or in captivity, civilians lost in shelling or trapped while living under Russian occupation. On the way to the camp, we pass cemetery after cemetery filled with fresh graves, yellow and blue flags rippling in the wind as the road winds through the Carpathian Mountains. The exact location is secret, but the area is achingly beautiful. The gentle slopes are smothered with brilliant green forests of spruce and fir. Russian bombs rarely fall here, giving both the children and the camp staff a much-needed break from the conflict. I'm visiting during a 2-week programme of individual and group counselling, sport, art therapy and fun for these deeply traumatised children. They're living in a frozen state, says Vanwi Martirosyan, the lead psychologist here. As we talk, her dog Lola bounds around the garden, playing with the children. They don't have this point of starting to grieve, and that makes this type of trauma maybe the most difficult to work with, she says. Van Wee tells me many of the children have multiple traumas, with more than one close family member killed or missing. Some have experience of living under the brutality of Russian occupation, or of homes being bombed. Some of them are afraid to cry, Van Wee sighs, because they think if they start crying, it will continue forever. One evening, at a group therapy session around a bonfire, the children are encouraged to open up and share their memories of their loved ones, and of the war in general. Each of them has lit a candle to represent the missing, the flames flickering in the breeze. They speak of the first time they heard explosions, the trauma of seeing their parents crying, panicking, the hurry to pack up treasured possessions and flee beloved homes. It is heartbreaking testimony. 15-year-old Dima from the Kharkiv region in northeastern Ukraine talks of his terror when missiles began falling on his village, and how his dad had joined the army to protect his family. Later, we catch up with Dima in private. He wants to tell me more about his dad. A psychologist joins us and was present whenever we spoke to the children. The last time he wrote to me was a message on WhatsApp, recalls Dima. He sent a video of them all drinking tea in the forest. He said, "Everything's fine. I'll call you tomorrow." The next day, Dima's mum got a call from the local military office to say his dad was missing in action. As he tells his story, his voice quivers. "When Mum told me, I said, that can't be right. Dad wrote to me yesterday and said everything was fine. I started calling Dad's mobile, but there was no answer," he says. "I didn't want to think that Dad had died. I kept hoping till the last, even now I hope, that Dad is a prisoner of war somewhere. You must be very proud of him for going to defend his country, I say. He sits up straight and looks right into my eyes. My dad was a hero, he says. He always encouraged me to look on the bright side and not be sad. I try to be happy, just like my dad. Art therapy sessions are held in the cafeteria, a large wooden building with a panoramic view of the mountains. Soothing Ukrainian music plays softly as the children paint. Camp psychologists say working with their hands helps to release anger. Their creations speak of hope. Families reunited, peaceful skies, words like dad and happy written in Ukrainian. Blue and yellow colours abound. 16-year-old Ira from the city of Kryvyi Rih is wearing an Eric Clapton t-shirt. She tells me about her dad, who also went missing on the front line. She shares a love of music with him, Ira says, Metallica, AC/DC, the golden age of rock, she laughs. Ira says the camp has helped her. With the psychologist, I was able to talk about my dad. It's the hardest thing for me to do, and I was keeping it inside of me for a really long time. One thing these children don't get much of is access to their mobile phones, which they hand in at the start of the camp. They get them back for just an hour every evening. After a few days of noisy protests, the phones are quickly forgotten. Oksana Lebedeva, the founder of the Gen Ukrainian charity, which studies childhood during war, says many of the children usually spend hours or days trawling Russian social media channels, desperately searching for information about their family members. The channels often contain violent content related to the war, such as torture and executions. Children need clarity, safety and simplicity, and these children are stuck in the middle of hope and despair, Oksana explains. Every single day they are waiting for a message from their parents. The children must often assume parenting roles for younger siblings too, when their remaining parent is out earning a living. On one of the camp hikes, a 7-year-old girl called Kira takes my hand and shares her surprisingly comprehensive knowledge of the local flora and fauna, and warns me to keep my distance from certain poisonous varieties. Her father, too, is missing in action. She wears a t-shirt with his photo on it, with the phrase, "I'm waiting for my dad," printed on it. Lead psychologist Van Wee says physical exercise is also key, as movement heals trauma, triggering hormones and reducing stress. We hope that they'll have a bigger window of tolerance, Van Wee tells me, that they'll make progress in being able to handle different emotional states and not be destroyed by it. At the end of the 2 weeks, a closing ceremony is held to say goodbye. As well as lots of hugs, each of the children is given a gift as a memento. A bracelet of red thread, which in Ukraine represents care, and a safety pin, meaning protection, with a tiny metal hippopotamus on it. They say that in nature, the hippo is the most loving, loyal parent of all. One boy, Ilya, is in floods of tears. He doesn't want to go home. We have a child like this in every camp, smiles Oksana, the founder of the charity. This is a place where you can open all your emotions. And when he did that, he felt that it's a sad time, she says. But it's going to be okay. She points to the throngs of children playing in the camp garden. Maybe for the first time in their lives, they've found people who went through the same experience. Group therapy is more important than anything, she insists, to see you're not alone with the pain. The wheels of the kids' suitcases trundle on the cobblestones as they make their way to the buses, which will take them to the local train station and onwards to their homes across the country. As the luggage is loaded, the final hugs are given out, the last selfies taken. The kids and the staff wave at us through the windows as the buses drive off. These 50 children are now hopefully better prepared to cope with the pain and the loss this conflict brings. But the scale of the task facing organisations like this one is overwhelming. The list of the missing continues to grow, and many of the children have multiple traumas, with several family members disappeared or killed and homes destroyed. Some have experience of living in towns under occupation. Gen Ukrainian tries to help as many children as possible. We have immense trauma in society, Oksana tells me, The challenge is huge. It's a humanitarian catastrophe.
Will Vernon, and you can hear more on that story on Radio 4's Crossing Continents on BBC Sounds. It's 80 years since the US dropped atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, leading to the end of World War II. It's believed some 200,000 people were killed, some from the immediate blast, others from subsequent radiation sickness and burns. But the bombing had other long-lasting effects for survivors, with many growing up to face discrimination and social stigma among fellow Japanese due to public misunderstanding about the effects of the bombs. Jordan Dunbar travelled to Hiroshima to speak to survivors.
The first thing that strikes you about Kenji Nakahara is his booming laugh. It echoes off the wooden walls of his office as he plies us with copious amounts of tea. We're in the naval district of Ujina, near the shipyards and naval base, a working-class district of Hiroshima. His smile slowly fades as he remembers the days and weeks after the atomic bomb was dropped, when he was 6 years old. If your hair fell out, you would die within 4 or 5 days, he recalls. I remember every morning I woke up, I would pull my hair, and if it fell out, I would get really upset. That fear lasted a long time. He pauses and takes a sip of water before adding, "Since I was exposed to the atomic bomb, whenever I get sick, I always wonder if it's related to the bomb." I meet another survivor, Mikio Saiki. He arrives promptly, dressed in a crisp linen suit with notes in hand. He bows deeply and tells me of his experience as a 13-year-old surviving the bomb. He speaks eloquently and seriously, but there's no overwhelming emotion, no visible anger or sadness. So when Mikio gets to what he saw on the day of the bombing, his story hits me like a brick. You couldn't tell if they were male or female. Their faces were such a mess, he says of the people he saw in the aftermath. The heat had shriveled their hair, making it stand on end. Mikio should have been at school that day, but a twist of fate saved his life. His teacher gave the class the day off, which kept him at home and away from the epicentre of the blast. Their faces were swollen up so they were blind. Their clothes and their bodies were badly burned and torn off, half naked, he went on. I was angry at that time. I was angry that these innocent people were turned into zombies, he said. The third survivor I met also stayed home from school that fateful day. Keiko Ogura takes my arm and leads me energetically to the street she lived on. Surrounded by newly built houses and shops, she pauses next to a shopping centre. She sweeps back the leaves of a tree and reveals an old stone shrine with a lantern on top. She points and tells me, he has known Hiroshima for 80 years, as long as I've known Hiroshima, so it seems like we're both survivors. Keiko was 8 years old on the day the bomb dropped. The scenes confronting her once she escaped the rubble of her home remain with her today. She tells me how other survivors from the blast in the city centre headed towards the hilltop Shinto shrine next to her home, seeking help. Somebody grabbed my ankle and said, "Water, give me water," she remembers. Hundreds of people were coming, she said. They said only water. They didn't say anything else. Speaking with Kenji, Mikio, Keiko and other survivors, the last of the only generation to have lived through a nuclear attack, I expected it would be these horrifying details of the blast to be what shocked me, but it was the legacy that they lived with that shocked me the most. For those who were children when the bomb dropped, survival was just the start. Mikio's disposition changes. He gets emotional when he starts talking about his experience of discrimination as a survivor. I was 26 years old when I left for Tokyo, he says. A person next to me on a bus asked, "Where are you from?" When I told him, "I'm from Hiroshima," he got agitated and he quickly got up from his seat. He thought he would be infected, Mikio explains. For decades, survivors of the bombs that hit Hiroshima and Nagasaki and their families would be subject to discrimination in Japan, as ignorance around the effects of radiation and the bomb were widespread. People were treated like they were infected or cursed. Survivors told me they knew of people who missed out on jobs and had marriage proposals turned down. I know friends and relatives who couldn't get married or have a wedding ceremony because they're from Hiroshima. People would say, "We don't want such a woman who was exposed to the bomb," Keiko tells me. The Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission was set up in 1946 by the US to investigate the long-term effects of radiation on the survivors of the bombing. But it didn't provide treatment to Japanese citizens, and the results of its research weren't available to those in Hiroshima. Reporting on the bomb was also heavily censored by both the US and Japanese authorities, which added to the misinformation and fear around radiation in Japan. Kenji was in the dark about the possible effects to his health for much of his life. It wasn't until much later, when I was in my 30s or 40s, that I learned radiation damages genes and can cause cancer. At the time, I had no idea, he says. The lack of information and stigma led to many survivors keeping their experiences to themselves. I heard of wives not telling husbands, fathers not telling children about what they'd lived through. Even those born in Hiroshima years after the bomb were subjected to prejudice, with many saying they'd tell strangers they grew up somewhere else. For Mikio, who had kept silent about his experience for nearly 8 decades, it was another war that made him decide that now was the time to speak. As we sit in a room at the Hiroshima Peace Museum, he sits up straight and looks me directly in the eyes and says, "When I turned 90, I realised that I was lucky. I had lived long and grew old. I was frustrated with the fact nothing had been done to abolish nuclear weapons. So I came to think that I had to testify because I didn't have much time left to live." It was at that time the Russian invasion of Ukraine started, Mikio tells me, and the news nudged him towards making a big decision. "I cannot stay quiet. I cannot keep being a bystander. I have to testify," he says defiantly. Of everything that I heard, it's the sense of shame the survivors were subjected to that will stay with me. That they could survive an atomic bomb, the radiation, the hunger, the health effects, and then be discriminated against. These children, who had nothing to do with the war, were punished twice. For Keiko, everything she suffered through and the terrible legacy of the bomb drives her to share her story. Without telling, without showing what happened, no one can understand clearly. And before I die, I have to tell people what I saw. Because telling, warning, is the important thing. When reflecting on his own fortunes as a survivor, Mikio looked at me solemnly and said, "Even now, I sometimes feel it is hard to live. I feel it is hell to die, but it is also hell to live."
Jordan Dunbar.
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
Next, we pay a visit to the only synagogue in Bahrain. Known as the House of the Ten Commandments, the building was destroyed back in 1947 in a wave of anti-British and anti-Zionist communal violence. But after several decades, it was eventually restored and finally reopened its doors again a few years ago. Today, the synagogue serves the kingdom's tiny Jewish community, as well as people of other faiths, including Muslims, as Iram Ramzan found when she went to Shabbat service there.
It's Shabbat morning in Manama. Inside the Bahraini capital's only synagogue, a young man sings a psalm. Wearing a neon green t-shirt and rocking gently, he stands at the lectern, tapping his hand every so often with the rhythm. Abdullah's Hebrew is fluent, but with an Arabic accent. He must be an Arab Jew, I think. Abdullah is actually Muslim, as are most of the congregants present. All beliefs are the same, he says matter-of-factly when I ask him why he's praying according to Jewish customs. We're all part of the Abrahamic family, he goes on. Before I arrived on this archipelago, I was curious about the ways in which different communities here coexist. Manama is the only Middle Eastern city I visited where Sunni and Shia mosques, Christian churches for various denominations, as well as a Hindu temple and synagogue are within walking distance of each other. I grew up Muslim, so this is my first Shabbat service ever. The fact that it's happening in a Muslim country makes it even more remarkable. We're handed laminated sheets upon which the psalm is written in Hebrew, as well as an Arabic translation. This is important because once people can read what Jews are praying about, they understand us better, says Ibrahim Nunu, the head of the country's Jewish community. He explains how the Quran and the Torah espouse a similar message. Ask any Muslim and they'll tell you that you can't be a Muslim without believing in the Torah, says Ibrahim. Jews have been on this island since the late 1800s, when they left Iraq to seek their fortunes in countries like Iran and India. In Bahrain, they were part of the fabric of society, working in commerce, banking and textiles. They all still speak Arabic with an Iraqi accent. After the psalms have been sung, we sit together to eat challah bread, washed down with grape juice, as well as roux afza, a rose-flavoured, milky beverage usually drunk in the Indian subcontinent. Wearing a traditional white thobe, 25-year-old Ahmed is a board member. In one amusing anecdote, he recalls how his grandmother would go to their Jewish neighbour's home on the Sabbath and switch on the stove for her. She'd even light the coals for her shisha pipe, he laughs, as he pushes more challah on my plate. I'm not saying Bahrain is perfect, but I think the rest of the world can learn about coexistence from us. A Lebanese Christian businessman explains that he tried to visit a synagogue in his country, but it was guarded by police and they refused him entry. It's not like here where anyone can come in, he says. Bahrain's House of 10 Commandments stands loud and proud in the middle of the bustling souk with no security. But there have been moments of upheaval. In 1947, Manama witnessed anti-Jewish riots following the UN vote on the Palestine partition plan. These tragic events led to a significant emigration of the Jewish population, particularly to the newly created State of Israel. Fewer than 40 Jews remain, out of an estimated 1,500 who were once here. Now, the island's Jews are enjoying their first overt existence as a community in decades. Before, they were accustomed to praying behind closed doors. Part of this is thanks to the Abraham Accords, a series of agreements mediated by the US under Donald Trump and signed in September 2020 between Israel and neighbouring Arab countries, Bahrain and the UAE. Israel's ongoing war in Gaza has put a strain on the accords, however. Israel retains a diplomatic presence in Bahrain, but it's very low-key. We understand the constraints the Bahrainis have, an Israeli official working in the Gulf tells me, but we can aspire for more, because we are facing similar threats. The threat he's referring to is Iran. Since the 1979 Iranian Revolution, the ruling elites in the Gulf have seen the mullahs as a destabilising force in the Middle East. Less than a fortnight after I left Bahrain, things escalated dramatically when Israel launched multiple airstrikes on several nuclear and military sites in Iran. For now, though, a fragile ceasefire holds. Which is why seeing Jews and Muslims coming together and breaking bread, literally and figuratively, is something that must be cherished. This is our history, says Ibrahim. We say in Arabic, Kul wahid li dinahum, everyone to their own religion.
Iram Ranzan. And finally to the warm, clear waters of the Adriatic Sea and the tiny Croatian island of Krapanja. It's one of the smallest inhabited islands in the region and has long been renowned for its tradition of diving for sponges, which have been harvested from the local waters and sold across southern Europe. But this tradition, which has shaped the island's identity for hundreds of years, is now under threat from commercialization and overfishing. Mary Novakovic met one of the island's few remaining divers.
It takes me less than 5 minutes to reach the Croatian island of Krapanja by the little ferry that goes from Brodarica on the mainland. I'm only a 20-minute drive from the Dalmatian city of Šibenik, but I feel as if I'm entering a different world. Krapanja is the smallest and lowest of Croatia's inhabited islands. Until the 1970s, it was also the most densely populated, with nearly 1,500 people squeezed into an area of 89 acres. Now, only about 100 people live here, some of them still clinging onto the island tradition of sponge diving that's been going on for more than 300 years. But this is in danger of dying out. In a courtyard garden just off the waterfront, I meet Rocco Tanfara, whose great-grandparents started the family sponge diving business back in 1896. At its height, there were 40 boats carrying crews of sponge divers. Now, Rocco is one of only 6 divers left. It was always arduous and dangerous work, Rocco tells me, with crews diving several times a day, usually for weeks at a time. But the men of Krapanje found they had a particular gift for it that had been passed down over the centuries. In the days before diving suits, men used to hold their breath for extended periods while they harvested sponges using spears. It's not surprising that several modern records for free diving were held by men from Krapanje. By the early 20th century, they were using diving suits with heavy helmets and weighted shoes so they could walk along the seabed to harvest the sponges. Men on the boat would be hand-pumping air into the hose connected to the helmet, praying that nothing would go wrong. Occasionally, and tragically, it did, like when, in 1936, Rocco's great-grandfather, Frane Tsurevic, died because of a faulty air hose, aged only 26. Rocco shows me the hose that caused the accident, as well as the helmet his great-grandfather was wearing. It's all part of the free museum devoted to Krapan's history of sponge diving that Rocco and his wife Milena set up by their house. It's a fascinating collection, revealing how much of the island's story revolves around sponge diving. If you go through history, Rocco says, every single house could have a museum like we do, because everybody was involved in it. As the island's population dwindled, so have the sponges. Part of this stems from overfishing by less scrupulous operators. Rocco explains how he and his team avoid certain waters for 3 years. We'll give it the time to regrow, he says. And when you pick as much as you need, not everything. We know how to protect it. But there's another problem. The same parasite that has been destroying molluscs like the fan mussel Pinna nobilis over the past few years has also been killing sea sponges. The situation has been much worse further south in the Adriatic, as well as the Aegean and other parts of the Mediterranean where the seas are warmer and getting hotter. Because of this, Rocco limits himself to the colder seas around Istria. He has already learnt how to deal with diminishing harvests. In previous years, he would collect up to 350 kilos. Now it's more like half that. He stopped selling sponges to wholesalers around the world and now sells them only directly through the museum's shop. This is not a job that will make you a multimillionaire, Rocco says, but it will make you enough so that you can live in this, he said, gesturing around the garden. And what more do you need? Good question. Later I take a walk around the island, which doesn't take long. Most of it is covered in pine forests and surrounded by pebbly beaches. There's a pleasing collection of Venetian-style stone houses near the harbour, including that of Rocco's family and their museum. I pass a 16th century monastery whose most famous occupant was the Franciscan monk Antun, who had arrived from Crete in the late 17th century and taught the islanders how to dive for sponges. This is what Rocco is trying to hold on to. We recognised a couple of years ago that this is going to vanish, he tells me. We need to fight against this because there are only a few places in the world that have a history like this, he goes on. Because if we lose this, we will lose everything. We lose our heritage, we lose our culture, we lose our tradition.
Mary Novakovic, and that's all for today, but you can hear more stories on the From Our Own Correspondent podcast on BBC Sounds, including a dispatch from Taiwan, where the long-standing tradition of fancy dress in politics is on the wane. We'll be back again next Saturday morning. Do join us.
I'm Rory Stewart, and I want to talk about heroes. When I was a child, I imagined a heroic future for myself in which I would achieve great things and die sacrificing my life for a noble cause before I was 30. But my experiences in the Middle East and in politics showed me that there was something deeply wrong with my idea of heroism. From BBC Radio 4, my podcast, The Long History of Heroism, explores ideas of what it meant to be a hero through time. How have these ideas changed? Who are the heroes we need today? Listen to Rory Stewart, The Long History of Heroism, first on BBC Sounds.
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.